Hey, everybody, again. This is Mr. Baker. It is Baker's Backyard or Baker's Corner. We're in our second installment of our discussion on basically the events that defined our revolution, brought about our revolution, and of course are going to define a lot of American history moving forward. So think about where we left off. So last time I left you with the question about whether this revolution was inevitable. I don't know what you all thought about that. Was it inevitable because of economic differences? Was it inevitable because of differences that are developing because of things like the First Great Awakening or the Enlightenment or whatever? And the answer is you could probably make a pretty significant case on both sides. All right. What we want to think about, guys, today is we want to think about how these attitudes toward the idea of rebellion and eventually declaring independence came about. So we're going to kind of end our discussion today a little bit into the events of the early battles that happened and focus our attention toward the end on especially the Declaration of Independence. So what do we need to do? We need to understand how and why attitudes about government and the individual change in the years leading up to the revolution. That was kind of like our stopping point last time. And we want to think about, guys, as we transition to actual fighting on the battlefield for session 3, we want to think about, okay, what are factors that are eventually going to kind of lead us in the direction of American victory? Okay, both sides had advantages and disadvantages, and we will talk about those a little bit more in our next session. So the question is, how are we developing a variety of different attitudes? Well, first of all, this is not an exhaustive list, but certainly some things that stand out. People over time are starting to develop a very wide variety of viewpoints on how government should be in relation to the person. They're starting to question, this parliament has too much power, this king is doing too much, etc. Okay, and so people start to piece together a lot of ideas because of the Enlightenment, the First Great Awakening, etc. And republicanism, guys, as a concept. Now, we're going to study this a little bit more as we break down this transition to a different government that we call the Constitution. And of course, even before then, the Articles of Confederation. But the big picture is republicanism is big. The idea of government without a king. This is precisely what that term is essentially getting at. But the big picture, guys, with this goes back to wanting people to be more actively involved with public life. Now, this is big, as we'll see on our next slide, because we need to have a people of virtue, a people or a group, guys, a community, if you will, of folks that actually have the best interest or the public interest in mind. Therefore, if you think back to the connection to the Mayflower Compact, remember back in 1620, they were not declaring independence. But what they were doing, guys, is committing themselves to a community of rule for the best interest of everybody. That is a big concept that comes along eventually in more detail. Okay? And then we have this concept of liberalism that develops a different way in the future as it will mean back then. So John Locke gets a lot of attention. Okay? His 2 treatises on government, things like that. Okay? This idea that government is a mutual what? Agreement, or even as he says, a contract. Okay? And that brings up, of course, a lot of ideas about natural rights, liberties, these moral liberties versus natural liberties and things like that. Okay? That obviously is not just unique to John Locke. You've got a lot of people, guys, that have views on this. French philosopher Rougeau that also came out of this time period. Very important, guys, to keep in mind. But the idea of, okay, what usually comes to mind? Individual rights. So we think of protecting civil liberties that people should have. Now, we know that this is not going to just go away just because we finalize a revolution. We know that there's eventually going to be focuses on states passing their own bills of rights. And then, of course, eventually the American Constitution adding that as a result of the work of our first Congress. Okay? But consent of the governed, rebellion against unjust authority. The question, guys, it becomes really complex with this. What is unjust? Who was the bigger problem? approaching the revolution? Was it King George or was it the Parliament? Those are not easy questions to answer, but they are necessary to ask. Why? Well, think about it like this. If you're arguing that abuse of power happened, who was abusing power more? Was it the king when he eventually declared the colonies in a state of rebellion, right? When they rejected, when they obviously had differences on moving forward, okay? In other words, they can't come to a consensus on the direction moving forward. Or is it Parliament that's been passing all of these different additional acts that have added taxes, have obviously managed to where the colonists have to quarter the soldiers, restricting other liberties, etc. You could argue, very important. And then even, guys, our own, what some historians call the American Enlightenment principle. We kind of see this bleeding in with where we left off with our last lesson of colonization, where we looked at the big effects of religion. Guys, a lot of us are like, well, religion happens. People want to basically be more unified. Guys, that unity plays a role with the idea of obviously the revolution, but also the idea of applying reason in different ways to religious thinking. You put all that together, and what do we notice? The influences, guys, in a lot of different ways that you see here. Okay, this creation, this concept, this vision, if you will, of this virtuous republic that's going to be based off of classical thinking, going all the way back to the idea of Greece and Rome. How much democracy should you put into a society? Our founders did not agree on that. Hamilton, obviously the famous person that we associate with the musical, does not have the same vision of that, guys, as other people at the Constitutional Convention. All right, we'll come back to that. Enlightenment thinking, the concept of having ideal citizens to look after that common good. And then even, guys, as you can see here with John Winthrop, the famous Puritan, going back to the idea of the influence of religion. Now, this is where all those ideas, guys, kind of connect. Government gets its authority from who? Of course, the citizens. The idea of public life, okay? Selfless, educated citizenry. We want to have people that are knowledgeable and also can lead us. Guaranteeing freedoms and rights. Balances of power. Think about, guys, Montesquieu with the idea of separation of powers and the idea of checks and balances. The need for a written constitution, something that is physical on paper. Out of many, one. We see that on our currency. The role of women with raising good, virtuous citizens. Okay? We call that Republican motherhood. Guys, the idea is that if you are really going to do the utmost job as a mother, as a person in society, obviously as a female, then your job, your main responsibility is what? Raising citizens. And guys, if you think about it, like early women's rights advocates, Abigail Adams comes to mind, writing a lot of letters to her husband John during the Revolution. We'll come back to those toward the end of our unit. It's not that big of a surprise, guys, why she wants the idea of educating women. Why? Because they're going to play a big role with raising citizens. Later on, somebody once said, and I think it makes a lot of sense, that a good, well-educated woman in society and family is basically ideal to passing on a functioning democracy. Pretty important. Okay. All right. So what we notice, guys, is we continue to see the development of armed conflict. All right. Keep in mind, we have a first Continental Congress in 1774. Most people at this point are not willing to declare independence. All right. The idea of negotiation, the idea of council, we need to get together, we need to talk about things. Yes, that is true. But a very large majority, guys, or at least a sizable minority for sure, are not at this point ready to say, okay, we're now leaving. That is important. Okay. But these principles are already very much in the minds of a lot of these revolutionaries. Okay. Which is why when we think about the American Revolution, guys, we want to think about the idea of, yes, there are ideas developing about government, what is good government, what is abuse of power, all those different things. Yes. But we also need to distinguish that the American Revolution lives long beyond the idea of the battlefield between 1775 and 1881, or I'm sorry, 1781 and 1783 with the official treaty process. Okay. So you've got patriots that are developing. They said, okay, we'll kind of reevaluate the current status around 1775. Of course, we know that eventually they're not convinced that that's going to work. And you basically have a Continental Congress, guys, that's making a lot of decisions that deal with things that really they have limits to. You know, it's going to be hard to raise an army. It's going to be hard to raise taxes when you have these states that are so committed to the idea of their personal freedoms. It's going to be hard. All right, we'll look at this a little bit later, but one of the biggest differences, or shall we say problems that George Washington saw was that idea of, you know what, I don't have the resources that I need. You got to help me out here. Okay. All right. So patriots start to, or shouldn't say start, continue to build upon their momentum. The committees of correspondence have been pretty active with trying to spread words. The idea of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, okay, spreading propaganda, gathering weapons, organizing local militia groups, the Minutemen that literally would have been ready to fight at a moment's or a minute's notice. And then, of course, as we know, guys, since the French and Indian War, there's been a stronger presence of British authority through military. Okay. And so as you can see here, you're going to see the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world, as people later on called it. Okay. And so what happens, May of 1775, we notice the official convention of the Second Continental Congress. Okay. Again, something to keep in mind. We have not formally declared independence. And the king has not formally said at this point in time that the colonies are in a formal state of rebellion. That will happen later, but it's not happened at this point in time. Okay. So as you can see, some of the earlier battles, Bunker Hill's a good example here. Britons win, but more casualties. Okay. So the question we want to think about, guys, for our third lesson on this is that what advantages do Americans have? You know, if we know that the British guys have, to a degree, a financial advantage, they have the ability to hire Hessian soldiers to serve. Okay. The Americans are having a lot of problems kind of getting everybody on board. You know, it suggested, guys, that by this, you know, declaration being issued a little bit over a year later, that there's maybe 50% of the colonials that are diehard patriots. Maybe. I've seen estimates as low as 33% and a little bit more along the lines of 40. So 1/3, 2/5, or half, you're going to see a little bit more of that develop, of course, over time. Okay. One of the bigger decisions that the Second Continental Congress makes is appointing George Washington as commander-in-chief. Now, something to keep in mind that's interesting, that's not mentioned here. A lot of people are like, well, man, it's got to be George Washington. Okay. You know, after all, I mean, you know, he was the no-brainer for the Constitutional Convention president and, of course, our first president. Guys, you got to remember, in some people's eyes, Washington is not going to be the best military mind. So why would they pick that? Well, think about it. Most of this early revolution is taking place in New England, right? At least a lot of the focus, like in Boston. Why would you want a Virginian to be commander-in-chief? If you can get somebody appointed that has a link outside of New England, that's maybe going to help the cause of the revolution spread to other places. Okay, so make no mistake about it, guys. Yes, he was a good selection, you could argue, but a very strategic selection at the same time. Okay, so Battle of Bunker Hill, guys, remember this is Charlestown up by Boston, not Charlestown down in South Carolina. Okay, and so therefore you'll notice, very important, over a year goes by. As you can see here, immediate goals of Washington. He does not have great resources. Throughout the entire war, not good resources. All right, adequate to win, but nonetheless, you read the documents, guys, he's very clear, help me out. Okay, so drive the British out of Boston. All right, that's been a hotbed. 1770, Boston Massacre, even before then. Disagreements on taxes, Stamp Act, etc. And then, guys, big here, securing the colonies from attack by British forces and their who? American Indian allies. Okay. The other thing that the British guys had going for them to a degree is this Lord Dunmore's proclamation. This is big. Okay. So if you were a slave and you basically went and fought on the side of His Majesty's army, right, or the military, then according to the Dunmore's pledge, this is basically giving you an opportunity to gain freedom as a result of this conflict. Now, as you can imagine, it's going to be really interesting what happens with this pledge when, of course, the end of the revolution happens. Another thing to keep in mind, guys, is what about all these loyalists? All right, a lot of you guys might know this. If not, I mean, you've got even families like Ben Franklin became a patriot. There's a wonderful book that kind of shows you the evolution of his thinking to become a patriot. His son, who I believe was a future or a governor, pardon me, of New Jersey, did not hold the same amount of shall we say, support for the United States and remained a pretty committed loyalist. Okay, so that's going to be a big thing too. What do you do with loyalists? Do they deserve punishment? Should we recognize, okay, they were simply trying to do what they felt was right for their best interest? Should they have their land taken? Not easy. Okay, and so all those different questions, guys, are popping up, which are not easy to be solved. All right, certainly before and certainly even afterwards. Okay, so December 1775, again, we're looking, guys, at a progression of events toward the independence. King George III, King George, the tyrant king, as some people called him, basically said, you know what, no negotiation or trade. So he's saying, okay, you want to think that you can do things on your own? We're still going to try to hold on to you, but we're cutting off trade. This is a sign, as you can see, guys, with this last point on the slide, that the Continental Congress, the second one, keep in mind, is aware the handwriting is on the wall to an extent. Independence is more supported. And therefore, what do? They reach out. Who do they reach out to? The French. Makes sense. Okay. Guys, the French, when they joined 1777, 1778 with that famous, alliance that we create, which we'll look at more later. Okay. It is very important, guys, to keep in mind that the French look at this as an opportunity to gain a balance of power in European, affairs. Therefore, yeah, they join us. But this does not happen right away. It takes time for them to recognize the United States. Recognition is a key thing. You see that over and over and over. The Spanish eventually join on our side as well, provide maybe not as much support as the French, but certainly, guys, it's safe to say enough support for us to win. Okay. So you can kind of see here, just real quick thing, guys, when you're looking at, the different groups, African Americans will serve in both His Majesty's Army with the British and also the United States. We'll look at that more next time. Okay. And then what really starts to kind of sway opinion more, and we'll look at this, guys, with our next session in documents, it's definitely going to be Thomas Paine's common sense. Now, keep in mind, Thomas Paine is not a natural-born American. He's actually born abroad. Of course, British comes over. What happens? Basically, he starts to kind of put some thought into this. You know, you've got this group of colonies thousands of miles away. He makes a lot of arguments in favor of common sense for why independence should happen. This pamphlet starts to basically spread throughout the colonies, and you can see, of course, its long-term effects. Okay, ergo, in early July, okay, we're going to see, moving into that time period, debates. Now, a lot of you guys have read the finalized version of the Declaration of Independence. Finalized meaning they revised it, they took things out. You know, most of it was still there, but there's a few changes. They focus on social contract. They focus on religious freedom. They focus on the idea of usurpations, which is a fancy way of saying wrongs that the king has done. Okay. And therefore, guys, as a result, most of that is actually going to be a long list of grievances or usurpations, as the colonists or the Americans called them, revolutionaries, that of course are going to be important. Now, a lot of you guys, if you've ever read the actual draft, you might say, well, man, there's a few things that aren't there. One of which is they took out the issue of slavery. Why? Because they understood that you're going to have people that are still, like South Carolina guys, still has a very, very connected trade to Barbados, the slave trade. Therefore, they knew it was going to be really, really difficult to keep them on the side. Also, remember, guys, South Carolina, other states too, especially southern states, a good number of them are going to be very committed to the Church of England. All right. So therefore, or the Anglican Church. So therefore, what do we notice? We notice that you got to really do a lot within reason to try to keep unity within these colonies and eventually states. Okay. So 12 states are going to meet. They're going to eventually sign, at least certain delegates from those states. July 4th of 1776. We've all heard that date before. Okay. Now, this is interesting. We don't see clear consensus about where to go with this independence. Okay. A fifth, about 20%, if that's accurate, are loyalists. Half of them are independents, but yet still, okay, neutral perhaps, right? Those that are basically in the other 30%. So guys, the point is you want to think about in your noggin, guys, how does this create problems moving forward with trying to generate revenue, with trying to generate, troops? Guys, you got to remember, I mean, the Continental Congress could easily tell the states, we need your money, we need troops. The states, we'll look at the constitutions that they created later on in some detail. They're not all going to think, okay, I have to comply in the same amount as the Congress wanted them to. Again, guys, if you're Washington, you are very upset about this for good reason. But nonetheless, we do know that we do have a Declaration of Independence that very much reflects the ideas of Locke, a lot of that liberalism from that first earlier part of this presentation, guys. And of course, we know that it's going to be an enduring thing. Now, we know there's going to be interpretations, all men created equal, etc. We'll look at that throughout parts of the rest of the year and beyond, okay, as we progress some, but it's something to keep in mind. How do you choose a side once independence has been declared? Okay. Well, we know Native American alliances are nothing new. Okay. But there is pressure. Just like the kind of pressure that was there when many of these earlier, empires guys, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, and of course the British as well, are trying to basically make their mark in America or the Americas. These groups, especially the ones that are more in North America, have a big decision to make because there's war, there's conflict. All right. And they know, right? They have chiefs and leaders and all that. They have tribal councils, etc. They know that they're going to have to make decisions that are in the best interest, or at least in trying to, of their of their uh, settlements. Okay, most loyalists remained in cities. All right, a lot of these larger cities are, in fact, if you think about it, guys, the revolution kind of goes, from the northern areas, and then eventually toward the latter few years or whatever, you're going to see more pardon me, more concentration in the southern states. So the revolution, guys, militarily is going to be fought in a series of phases. We'll look at that in our next session. Okay. Women are going to be involved. We covered that a little bit before, even with the idea of them making clothes and things like that. That's going to become an ever important more important thing during the war. And then, guys, as you can see, I mean, pause for a moment and ask yourself the question, what stands out about the map here? Well, what stands out to me is, again, large cities. Philadelphia is key. New York is key. Now, the one big city that we noticed that does not have as much loyalist support is, of course, going to be Boston. Makes a lot of sense, given it's kind of like the, one of the bigger areas that we saw with like mass protest over stamp acts, things like that. Okay, but guys, you notice that, and that's going to be hard, because if Britain can control those places that are mostly coastal cities and harbors, what's going to happen? They're going to be able to control areas that they can land their military. It's pretty important. Weekly reminders. We'll come back to this, guys. Ask yourself the question: advantages, disadvantages. What kinds of things do both sides have to bring to the table to give them a degree of strategy, advantage, etc.? Okay. So week 4, you should be able to do a pretty solid job, guys, looking at some of these things that actually were building up to the battles and things like that. We're not going to spend a ton of time on that on our next session, but we are going to look at a little bit more with society. How does society, how is society affected? Again, so we'll look at that, and then we'll also look a little bit more at creation of government. Okay, primary source activity for week 4. You're going to see, guys, a lot of connections to these documents. Okay, so not going to be a big surprise why I'm having you read, and look at maps and things like that. And then, of course, office hours this week. Now, something to keep in mind: we are not doing a short answer question for week 4. Okay, so what that means is that we're going to wrap up, guys, the introduction to essay writing skills, and I'm going to give you the actual question for your first essay. Okay, you'll have a week to submit that before we actually start to look at the next set of skills, and I'll give you details on that. As always, feel free to email me at bakerd@franklincomedy.org with any questions, things that you need me to give you some assistance with, etc. Otherwise, guys, hope you have a wonderful day. Hope you're staying safe. And as always, guys, hope you had a good session. I hope that you also are finding these videos helpful, and I hope that our next session will continue to build upon a lot of these founding principles, and the rest of the year for that matter. Take care, and I will see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.